Good evening everyone, and welcome to another Sustainable Macleod presentation. This one is on Botany for Home Gardeners, and Emily Willocks is presenting the workshop. First of all though, I'd like to acknowledge that we're presenting this workshop from the lands of the Wurundjeri, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Emily is eminently qualified to present the workshop. She's trained in both botany and permaculture, and she also is the Vice President of Sustainable Macleod. Emily, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining in. So a little bit more about me. So as Paul mentioned, I studied botany at university. I went to La Trobe and did conservation, biology and ecology, but majoring in botany there. Some people sometimes ask me why I did botany. And my answer to that, I think, is because animals are pretty annoying and they move around when you try and study them, whereas plants stay nice and still. So that's kind of what led me on the path to botany. But I think plants are pretty cool anyway. So today I'm going to go through some basic botany that we use as home gardeners. So I've pulled out some little snippets of theory of things that you might not know the theory behind, but you might be already doing the practical application of it in your garden. So hopefully this will help fill in some of the gaps for people about why we're doing things a particular way. Just a note, we are recording this presentation, so we'll put it up on our YouTube channel. If you don't want your, and we'll edit this out a little bit, if you don't want your face on there, just turn your camera off, and if you can change your name if you prefer as well. So I'm going to share my screen. If you don't have access to a screen, that's okay. I'll explain as I go, but some of the pictures will probably help the explanations a little bit. So let me just share the screen. Paul, can you see that? Yep, great, thumbs up, awesome. So botany for home gardeners. So, and just moving my screen around a little bit, hang on. Okay, so today the focus is going to be on flowering plants, our angiosperms, rather than some of our other plants like conifers, mosses or fungi, which actually aren't plants. So yeah, focus today is on our flowering plants. All right, so I'm going to start with plant classification. So biologists like to put things in groups of like things and give them names. That's kind of one of the basic fundamentals of biology. So we use this classification system to divide things into different groups. So at the top of our hierarchy, we've got kingdom. So that's where we separate out our plants, our animals, our fungi, our bacteria into different kingdom groups. As we work further down the hierarchy, the groups get smaller, which means the living things within that group are much more similar to each other. So in botany, we tend to focus down on the family, genus and species. So that's really the much smaller groups of plants that we're looking at. Okay, next slide. So here, we're talking about families here. So this is some of our common families of plants and common families of vegetable crops actually. So some of our families, we've got Amarylliaceae family, which is our chives, our garlic, our leeks, our onions, etc. Another one you'd be familiar with is your Brassicaceae family. So that's our broccolis, our cauliflower, cabbage, radish, kale, etc. And the other one that we grow a lot of in our home gardens is the Solanaceae family. So that includes our eggplant, tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, etc. So all of those groups of plants are quite closely related to each other. So why do we care about this? So things in the same family often have similar requirements in terms of water, nutrition, their growing conditions, and they also often have similar pests. So if we think about our cabbage butterfly, which is the white butterfly that you'll see fluttering around your vegetable gardens and lays eggs on our brassica family plants. And we get those green caterpillars that come and munch on our kale and our broccoli and decimate them if we let them go. And the cabbage butterfly affects pretty much all of the plants within the Brassicaceae family. The other reason we care about families is when we're thinking about crop rotation. So crop rotation is a whole separate topic that we could do a whole nother session on. But if we're trying to do crop rotation in our garden and we plant broccoli one season and then we plant some kale and then we plant some radish, we're actually only rotating what we're growing in the garden. We're not doing crop rotation because they're all in the same family of plants. So that's kind of why we want to understand what families plants are in. Another interesting one here is family names usually end in CEAE or EAE. So this is useful to know if you're looking up things online or at the nursery, and to know if you see this ending on the words, you're probably talking about a plant family. So that's just a handy hint. And all right. So now we're getting further down our hierarchy and we're going to focus in on the genus and species. So native plants in particular, we tend to use our scientific names rather than the common names. So the scientific names make it certain that we're talking about the same thing. So if we're explaining to someone that they should grow this native plant in their garden, by using the scientific name, we know that we're talking about the same plant. However, if we go and tell someone, oh, you should go plant a wattle in that spot in your garden, well, a wattle is a common name for a species of acacia, and there's hundreds of species of acacia in Australia. So we could be talking about different things. So to get to our scientific name, we combine together the genus and the species. So those two parts of the hierarchy together result in the scientific name of a plant. So I've pulled up the Cucurbitaceae family. So this is our pumpkin, zucchini, cucumber, etc. And you can see here we've got Cucurbita maxima, the genus, and the species is our pumpkin. So common name is our pumpkin. Whereas scientific name Cucurbita pepo, genus and species, is our zucchini, common name. Because they're both in the same genus, they're quite closely related to each other, and they're in the Cucurbitaceae family. Down the bottom there, I've got Cucumbers sativus, which is our cucumbers. So they're still in the same family, but they're not as closely related as the pumpkin and zucchini are to each other because they're in different genus. So this is how we can use scientific names to understand how closely related different plants are. For fruit and vegetables, we primarily do use common names rather than scientific name. And we often also have variants. This is like another hierarchy below the species name. I think that's all I wanted to share on how we name plants. Now going to jump into awesome bit, which is our monocots and dicots. So these are probably words that you might have heard, but didn't necessarily know what they mean. So the word cot comes from cotyledon, which is the baby seedling that, or the baby leaves in the seedling that come up when it first emerges from the ground. So monocots, they come up with one leaf, whereas dicots on the right-hand side there, they come up with two leaves. So monocots are our grasses, chives, onions, leeks, but also corn, bamboo, and bananas are monocots. And dicots are most of our other plants, and they tend to have branches and structure to them. If we think about the typical monocots, they're like our grasses, they tend to be strappy, long-leafed plants. A few things we know about monocots and dicots. So monocots have flower parts in multiples of 3, and that becomes important when we are trying to identify a plant and we key them out. That's one of the flowering parts are one of the key identification criteria we use. Monocots also have quite fibrous roots. So we can use that knowledge in our home garden to know that monocots, we can probably chop them into sections or chunks and plant each section because their fibrous roots will survive and be able to grow into new plants. Dicots, on the other hand, they have flowering parts in 4s or 5s, and they have taproots. So they might have one or they might have many taproots. And if we're going to divide a dicot, we would need to make sure that we're getting the taproot in addition to some of the fibrous roots in order for the plant to be able to transplant or divide. Okay. So now I'm sharing the plant life cycle. So we all probably know this information, but we might not have thought through the process. So I'm just going to go through it. So we've got a seed, which turns into a baby seedling, which turns into an adult plant that has flowers. The flowers get pollinated, which turns into a fruit with seeds, and then we get germination of the seed again. So it's important for us to understand that it has to happen in this cycle. So without flowers and without pollination, we're not going to get fruit. Unless we've got fruit, we're not going to have seeds to be able to grow into baby seedlings. So if something isn't going right in this cycle, for instance, if the most common complaint is I'm not getting fruit on my plant, we can then start to think about what's going wrong in this process. So are we missing our flowers, or do we not have pollinators, or what is it that is broken in the system that means it isn't going all the way around? Okay. Next, we're going to talk about flowers. So I love flowers. I love pulling apart flowers. I like looking at all the bits inside them and working out what they are. So they're pretty cool. There's so many different types of flowers, but they all have pretty much the same features. So you're probably never going to go and look at a flower the same again after this. You're probably going to be looking up close and pulling them apart. And I find that really exciting. So as I mentioned before, we use flowers and how they're arranged as one of our key ways of identifying plants. And I'll show you my flora when I've turned the screen share off so you can kind of see the keys we've got in Australia. So why am I going through the parts of the flower? Well, if we want to help plants get fertilised, which is something we commonly do with things like our pumpkins and zucchinis, we need to know which parts of the flower are which. So we've got our boy bits of the flower. So this is our stamen, which has the filament, the sticky bit, and then the anther on top, so which is the yellow part there. So the anther is where the pollen forms on the flower. So that's the boy sperm. The girl bits of the plant are our stigma. So the stigma is up the top. That's where we need the pollen to land in order to fertilise the plant. It's on a style, which is a bit of a stem, and then it's got the ovary down the bottom where the fruit will form. This is quite obvious in our pumpkins and zucchini flowers, partly because the flowers are so big so we can get a good look at them. But you'll notice there'll be a bit of a bulb at the bottom of the female flowers. So this flower diagram we've got here is actually quite clever. This flower probably doesn't want to fertilise itself, so it's put the pollen below where the stigma is. So the anther, the pollen forming part, isn't going to accidentally fall on the stigma and fertilize itself. Probably wants another pollinator to come in and pick up some pollen and take it to another flower. So flowers that need an animal or something to transfer the pollen from one to another, they often, or a bird or a bee or something like that, they'll often have nectar, and the flower will form the nectar right down the bottom so that the insect or bird has to get right into the flower in order to get to the tasty stuff. But along the way, it'll brush up against the pollen. And then when it goes to the next flower, on the way in to find that tasty nectar, it'll drop some pollen on the stigma and fertilize that flower. Okay, so there's, as I mentioned before, there's multiple different ways that plants and flowers arrange themselves. So I'm just sharing a diagram that's from one of my textbooks, actually. So it's not the greatest photo, but I think it still describes it most clearly what the different possibilities are with plants. So on the left-hand side, we've got a plant with flowers that have both male and female bits on the same flower. So that's things like our tomato do this. It's the most common arrangement in our garden, that both the male and female parts of a flower are in the same flower. Some plants go a step further to make sure they're not, or to try and avoid pollinating themselves. And what they do is they put the male and the female flowers on different flowers within the same plant. So this is things like our zucchini. That's what they do. We have male flowers and female flowers on the same plant. So if we want to help pollinate those, we can get the part of the pollen off the male flower and go and dab it on the stamen of the female. Some plants go even further to make sure they're not pollinating themselves. And they have male plants and female plants. So they have some plants that are girls that will have flowers that will form fruit. And they have other plants that are purely male. They will never fruit, but we need to get the pollen off those ones onto a plant that's a female in order to pollinate them. So our kiwi fruit is an example of these. So we've got kiwi fruit down at the community garden, and we actually lost our boy, I think it was the boy kiwi fruit that died. So even though we had a bunch of girls still living, we were never going to get fruit off them unless we planted another boy. So the boy can produce flowers that has pollen in it to then fertilize the female plants. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, that some plants do need a male and a female. The native pepperberry is another example of a plant that has both the male and the female on different plants. Okay, so we're talking a lot about flowers. So we're going to talk a bit about pollination and some of the adaptations that flowers have, and what that can tell us with how they might be pollinated, and therefore what we might be able to do to encourage pollination. The focus I'm giving to pollination is because that's, remember, the plant life cycle, that's what gives us our fruit and therefore our seeds. So they're usually the parts that we're after in our productive home gardens. So first off, we've got pollinators, the European honeybee. So the bees can pollinate flowers from kilometres away. So they'll travel from their hive out to a good patch of flowers, go between different flowers, which by virtue of them diving in to get the any tasty stuff, any nectar or eating the pollen, they'll be pollinating the plants. European honeybees are a communal bee. They live in hives, and when they find a good spot, they'll go back and tell their friends how to get to it, and so we'll get more bees in our gardens. So again, there's probably a whole session we could do on attracting bees to your garden, But a few things we can do is having lots of flowering plants year round in our garden. Particularly bright yellow, white or blue flowers tend to attract the bees. And if they're coming into your garden to get to those, they'll also see your veggie garden at the same time and have a go at pollinating those plants too. The best way to attract would be planting flowers for bees is actually in large groups rather than scattering those plants throughout the gardens. The bees will be more attracted to a large group of flowering plants than they will be to the same number of individual plants scattered throughout everywhere else. Okay, so when we think about bees, we typically do think about the honeybee, but there's over 1,700 species of native bee in Australia. So it's a really big genus, the bees. In Victoria, all of the native bees we have are solitary. They live on their own, not in hives. And there's about a dozen species in the whole of Australia out of that 1,700 that actually live in hives. But they all live in from northern New South Wales further north, so they like the warmer climates. Here we've got a picture of a blue-banded bee. The blue-banded bees are a native bee, and they're excellent at buzz pollination of some of our tomato, capsicum, chili plants, etc. So how do we attract native bees to our garden? So one way is planting Indigenous plants, so plants that are native to the area and that have lots of flowers year round. We also need to make sure the bees have a place to live. So you can create bee hotels to give them some habitat. And some bees actually burrow into dirt. So burrow into the clay or the soil. So by having small areas of our garden that are clear of mulch, which again is against some of our other principles of gardening that you have to keep your soil covered all the time. But if we want bees to have somewhere to live, they need like a clay bank or soil to be able to burrow into. So that's another way we can help encourage them in our gardens. Okay, so next we're talking about wind pollination. So by looking at the flowers, we can often guess that the plant is wind pollinated. The pollen's usually quite exposed, ready to be blown off, and the styles are often furry and ready to pick up any fallen pollen that might fall. So pictures I've got here are of corn. So corn's a great example of a plant that's pollinated by wind. And it has boy bits and girl bits on different flowers on the same plant. So the pollen forms in the tassels up the top of the plant, so that's our boy bits. And the pollen needs to go and land on the silks, the ears of the corn, further down the plant. And that's where our corn cob forms. So what can we learn from plants that need this? So we already know we plant corn in a grid pattern to improve pollination. And this is why we need the pollen from the tassels to fall onto the silks down below. Also, now that we know what are the boy bits and girl bits of our corn, we can do some hand pollination if we don't think we're getting good enough pollination. So we can pick up a tassel, a bit of the pollen, and go and dab it on the styles, the furry bits, and that will increase our pollination rate of our corn. Okay, so next, last one of pollination. Got a tomato plant. So tomatoes are wind pollinated. They're also self-fertile, so that they will pollinate themselves. However, we get better pollination if there's a gentle breeze and we can get pollination between different flowers. So how we can apply this in our garden, and particularly if we're growing tomatoes in a greenhouse or other sheltered area that doesn't get much wind, We can gently tap on the stems to simulate the wind, and that'll improve our pollination rates of our tomatoes. Okay, so that's the end of pollination. Next, we've got a question that I'm sure some of you have been asked by children in your family. Why are plants green? So, plants are full of chemicals that are green, so that's why they're green. But the main one is chlorophyll. So chlorophyll lives in a structure inside the leaves called chloroplasts. So chlorophyll absorbs some sunlight, and a series of chemical reactions happen to convert the light into energy, so into our sugars, amino acids, etc. And we call this process photosynthesis. So it's a word you're probably familiar with. So I'll go into a bit more detail about photosynthesis, and note this diagram isn't 100% right, but that's okay. So we get sunlight and carbon dioxide and water comes into the plant. Inside the chloroplast inside the leaves of the plant, photosynthesis happens, and the plant releases oxygen and sugars. The sugars actually don't leave the plant, they go back into the circulatory system of the plant so the plant can grow. So that's when I said the diagram's not right, but that's okay. So again, we need sun, carbon dioxide and water for a plant to grow. Okay, so we're getting a little bit more technical here. So this is how air, so carbon dioxide, gets into the plants. They come through structures on the leaves called stigmata. And when we're back at the garden, if people are interested, I can try and get a dissecting microscope down there so that we can have a look at these under the microscope. They work really well on a 10 times dissecting microscope. You can see them quite clearly. And you can see whether the stigmata are open or closed. So that's quite cool. So we're zooming in again. So now we're on the leaf structure inside the leaves. So this is where photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast. So that's the green bit I talked about earlier. I'm sharing this because it shows how the carbon dioxide gets into the chloroplast in order for photosynthesis to happen. Through the open pores on the stigmata. If plants are getting a bit stressed, if plants are getting a bit stressed and losing too much water, they actually close their stigmata, which stops any water escaping, but it also stops the carbon dioxide getting into the leaves, which means the plant can't do photosynthesis and therefore it's not growing. So this is particularly important on a hot day, and why we always say on hot days you have to keep the water up to your plants. But this is why, because if the plant feels it's losing too much water, it'll close its stigmata to protect itself, but it also means it can't do photosynthesis. And I had a really good example of the impact of water in my garden. So I think it was zucchinis, and I planted some in my wicking bed and some in the normal garden bed next to it. So I planted at the same time from the same punnet, nothing different except one was in a wicking bed and had more access to water than the other. So we had some pretty hot series of days. The ones in the wicking beds went crazy. They were growing like mad. And the ones in the normal garden bed basically didn't grow. They were stressed, they'd closed their stigmata, therefore they couldn't do photosynthesis and therefore they weren't growing. Okay. So that's a bit of photosynthesis. So who's had this happen in their garden and in their seedling punnets? I'm sure a lot of us have. We're growing some seedlings on a windowsill and the plants go and lean towards the sunlight. We all know that that's what they're after the sun, but how? What's happening? So this is getting caused by plant hormones. The hormone that's impacting here is actually auxin, which is the first plant hormone that was discovered, and it was discovered by Charles Darwin. So a long time ago, for a long time, we've known about plant hormones. So auxin causes cells to get longer. So what's happening here is the cells on the shady side of the tomato stems are getting longer, which is causing the plant to bend towards the light. Okay, another impact of plant hormones are our climbing plants, our beans, peas, passion fruit again. So again, it's primarily the hormone auxin that's having an impact here. And auxin is making the cells on one side of the tendrils longer. So the tendrils bend around and can grab onto whatever there is to grab onto, your trellis, hopefully. So plant hormones are pretty cool. Another impact of plant hormones is what we call apical dominance. So this is where a plant stops producing branches below the top bud. And if we chop off the top bud, we get a really quite bushy plant. So we use this all the time, all of us do in our gardens, where we give everything a light prune to help it stay bushy. So things like our lavenders or rosemary or oregano, etc. We know that if we keep pruning them a little bit all over, they'll get nice and dense and bushy. But this is happening because of the hormone. It's a type of auxin as well. I should say all of these processes, there's often multiple hormones at play, but I'm just talking about kind of the main one here. So this is probably something you've also done in your kitchen. You've got some unripe fruit or tomatoes and you put them in a bowl with some bananas and it helps ripen them faster. So what's happening here? Well, we've got another hormone at play, and bananas give off a lot of this hormone. The hormone's ethylene, and it helps fruit ripen. Commercial growers use this and supermarkets use this to ripen produce. So they'll pick produce unripe, and then when they're ready for things to go to sale, they'll pump ethylene into shipping containers, and that'll help ripen the produce. We do this in a smaller scale on our kitchen bench. But it also happens in our gardens, where you might notice that sometimes all of the fruit start ripening at once. So what's probably happening is there is some of the ripe fruit are giving off ethylene, which triggers all of the other fruit to also start ripening at the same time. So I've only talked about a few different hormones there. Hormones can do a whole host of different things. They can encourage growth, they can make roots grow bigger, they can encourage flowering, reduce stress. Gibberellins, they key hormone in germination of seeds. For the most part, we don't need to be adding extra hormones to our plants, but there is one circumstance where we might do it, and that's where we're taking cuttings and we go and dip the end of the cutting into the little powder. That powder usually contains root growth hormone, which will help the roots grow more vigorously. So that's when probably the one you might use a little bit in your home garden sometimes. Okay. I'm going to now talk about one of my favourite families of plants. So this is the Ferbasey family. This is all of our legumes, our beans, our peas, but also a lot of native species. All of our acacias, like the wattle on the left picture there, or Pollination egg and bacon plants like the bottom right. Ferbasey flowers are a very distinctive flower type. They've got some fused petals. So when I said that flower parts in the multiples of 4 or 5 for dicots, that's true. Legumes, it might look like there's only 3, but we've actually got some petals that are fused together. We use legumes in our crop rotation systems to help put nitrogen back into the soil. So that's a key use of this family of plants. So you might have seen this on some roots when you've pulled out some legumes from your garden. So this is actually the nodules where nitrogen fixing bacteria live inside these nodules and the plant. So the plant basically provides a home for these bacteria. Bacteria live there, and what they do is they convert nitrogen from the air into a form that the plants can then absorb. So it's a mutual benefit relationship. The bacteria get somewhere to live, and the plants get nitrogen that otherwise they can't access from the air. This is a really clever evolutionary tactic that plants have, particularly plants that grow in infertile soils. So that's why we have so many Australian plants in this family. Plants in Australia, or soils in Australia, tend to be quite old and often quite infertile. So legumes under these conditions thrive because they don't need to worry about getting nitrogen from the soil. They can get that from their friends, the nitrogen fixing bacteria that live in the little nodules on their roots. Okay, so talked a little bit about one element that plants need. There's a whole lot of diagrams online about plant nutrition and different deficiencies that you might get in your plants. So again, I think this is probably a whole nother session about plant nutrition, but I just want to highlight that plants need a whole lot of different things in order to be able to function, and will have symptoms in different ways if they're missing particular things. I'm going to finish off on pH of soils and relate that back to our plant nutrition. So some of you would have seen this diagram before. We've got the different pH of the soils running across the top. So really low pH, really acidic soils, all the way to really alkaline soils. What's important about this is if we've got a plant that's exhibiting symptoms that they're missing something in their nutrition, adding fertilizer might actually not be the answer to solve your problems. Because different nutrients are accessible to plants at different pH, your problem sometimes is that not that there isn't enough of something in the soil, but the pH isn't right for the plant to be able to absorb it. So why this happens, as the pH in the soil changes, the nutrients change what form they are in the soil. And some forms, like the nitrogen in air, can't be taken up by plants. So yeah, when we're thinking about what's wrong with my plant, this might be another reason of what's going on in your garden. So that's all I had to share. I'm happy for thoughts, comments, take questions, all of that stuff.
I'd just like to say that was fantastic. I'd love to see that relationship between understanding what's actually happening in a plant and then being able to grow it successfully. The bit that really took my fancy was the photosynthesis, and the reason why you actually need water, particularly on a hot day, for a plant to grow properly. Fantastic. Now I understand a whole lot more.
Yep, there's a lot of things that we know that we should be doing, or we're telling people that they should be doing, but it's a one-off, we need to do this in our garden. But I think if we understand a bit more about how the plants actually operate, we'll be able to apply that into other situations.
So if people would like to ask questions or make comments, you're welcome to switch your sound on.
So I've got a question. Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, good. So where do the sugars go exactly through photosynthesis? I was listening to Matthew Evans on the radio the other day. He has a new book on soil, and I wasn't sure where the sugars went, but he seemed to be suggesting that they went back into the roots of the plant. Can you explain?
Yeah, so this was actually something that I took out of the presentation because it was getting a little bit technical.
Oh, well, just what I want to know.
So plants have a circulatory system, just like we do.
Yeah.
In plants, it's called xylem and phloem.
Yeah.
And monocots and dicots arrange their xylem and phloem in different ways.
Yeah.
And is it the phloem the sugars go into, I think?
Right.
And basically, it goes back into the circulatory system, which gets moved around the plants, which allow the plant to grow.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I have a question too, Emily.
Sure.
So when you were showing the pores that open on the leaves and how they can close to stop water leaving, do they then reopen when the heat decreases?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
So yeah, when they open, and there's structures in the leaf that open and close as the plant wants them to.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Deb?
Thank you. That was great. I'm really sorry I was late. I couldn't find the link. It was great. Can you tell me about like Tagaste? Some people talk about that as a nitrogen fixer too. Is that in favour? Do you know what I mean? That whatever that plant is from the Canary Islands or something that people plant in the garden to build up the soil?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about that particular one, but you might know.
David Holmgren certainly recommends that.
Yeah.
And it's a cut and drop kind of plant. It's good fodder for some animals like goats and so on.
Yeah.
So is it a particular type of Tagetes? Because I think there are a number. I mean, like
I've just looked it up.
Tarragon is a Tagetes, I think.
So the one I've just found, it's in the Ferbasey family as well. So it does have that nitrogen fixing function.
Deb, I think you've probably seen it. It's a bushy plant and it's usually got white flowers, but I've seen something very similar in near St John's Community Garden with yellow flowers as well.
Yeah, I have one growing, but I know it's debatable because I think some people don't like them because they're not native. Maybe they don't suit the Australian soil. But I'm not.
Its other name is a treeless Tagaste.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we grow a lot of things that aren't native, don't we?
Absolutely. Very acclimatised that way. Can I ask another question?
Of course.
Just tell me more about the bees. So I missed what you said about encouraging bees to your garden. There was something about, is it like not scattering the flowers? Is that what you mean? Like if you've got 10 seeds, plant them all together or close to one another rather than scattering them around your garden?
Yeah, for the European honeybee, they're more likely to find your garden and those flowers if they're in a larger group, rather than scattering them throughout.
Yeah.
Also, because they go back to the hive and tell all the other bees in their hive about this amazing garden that they've just found with lots of flowers. If there's lots together, they're more likely to go and get their friends.
And do you know, do they exhaust one nectar source and then they go to the next nectar source?
They tend to, yeah.
Okay.
So they send out their, is it the worker bees or one?
Yeah.
The bees first thing in the morning to go and find where the good sources of flowers for the day are. Yeah. Those bees will then come back to the hive, do a dance to explain where those flowers are and how to get to it. And then all the other ones will go off on the way.
So sticking with that idea of pollinators, Emily, We've had thornbills over the last couple of years visiting to get nectar from the pineapple sage, little red flowers on the pineapple sage. Are they also doing some pollinating while they're doing that? Or
Absolutely.
Good.
So that's the whole reason that plants have nectar in them. It's to attract their pollinator, which can be a bird or a bat or all sorts of other things. And they'll have the nectar right down the bottom. So the bird has to get all the way in to be able to get it. And it will get pollen brushed off on its feathers as it does that. And then the next flower it goes to, some of that pollen will fall off, hopefully onto the stamen or the girl bits of that flower and pollinate it.
Great.
Do you know where blue-banded, oh, sorry.
No, you're on.
Oh, okay. Do you know where blue-banded bees live? Because I've noticed more of them around. Do they live in the soil or in?
I'm not 100% sure. There is so many different sorts of bees and native insects. I think the key there is probably just having a variety of different options in your garden, different habitats for them to be able to attract all of the different native pollinators in.
Yeah, diversity seems one of those really important things, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So one thing that I mentioned earlier was going to show you a book that I've got. So this is, it might be backwards on your screen, I'm not sure.
No, that's fine.
So this is the Flora of Australia. So this is just the first volume of it. There's about 20 or 30 different floras, and they describe every native species of plant in Australia, and they key them out to be able to get down to them. So in here, this is the introduction. So it has the keys to families, and you might be able to see that there, that it's basically a very complicated key or decision chart, which will eventually get you to which family of plants that is. So you then know which other book to go pick up and key it out further into your genus, and then eventually get to your species. So you can identify all your native plants through the floras. I actually had a whole subject at uni, and the exam was 3 hours. We got given a bunch of plants, and I thought it was great fun. I loved it, but other people hated it. And yeah, trying to key out what you've got in front of you.
Wow. Wow.
Wow, indeed. Marie-Louise, you have to turn your sound on.
Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can.
Yeah. Just when you were talking about the plants, I remember last year Marina always saying to me, oh, you have to plant flowers, or why don't you plant flowers? But she didn't explain why. So I thought, no, I only want vegetables. So I only was growing green things. And now I'm curious about the plants. Can they be actually interspersed with with the vegetables? Like, even so it's supposed to be a field of it, but can they be?
Yeah, absolutely. Some is better than none. So we will definitely still get beneficial insects and bees into your garden with interspersing them.
Yeah, so if I have a whole lot of, like, with spinach and everything, and I can plant other things in between.
Yep, why not?
Okay.
So yeah, remembering back to that plant life cycle.
Yeah.
And the pollination step is a key step in order to get our fruit.
Great. Yeah, great presentation. Thank you.
No problem.
Can I just ask a question? It's Christine here. I've noticed that the bees in my garden really love the herbs. So things like rosemary, and at the moment, like my Mizuna's gone to flower, and they're just absolutely loving that. So I know sometimes it's sort of tempting to chop off all the flowers or pull them out when they're going to seed, but I find even with the parsley, they really, really love all of those herbs going to seed. So yeah, I probably would recommend that. And thanks for your presentation. It's been really good.
No problem. And interesting you say that bees are often attracted to things like our rosemary and lavenders and things like that. If we think about where those plants have come from, they've come from the Mediterranean and Europe. That's also where the honeybee lives. So we're planting plants that are basically their normal native food.
Mm.
Yeah. Oh, so I have another question. Why is it that family names keep changing?
So family names, I think, are pretty much settled now.
Right.
There was a period of time where they moved some of our family names so that they had that ending of EAE or ACAE.
Yeah.
So some of the older families didn't have that ending. And I think that's kind of why they've, changed those.
Right.
I mean, the hierarchy of plants is pretty much settled.
Yeah.
So, we're not expecting families, for the most part, to change their names.
Thanks.
Sometimes they do split the genuses though.
Yeah, the
Like a
changes are
eucalyptus.
more likely to happen the lower down in the hierarchy.
Yeah, like when they split eucalypts.
Yep.
Up a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
While I'm unmuted, can I ask a question?
Sure.
What's the best way of taking those nitrogen nodules and putting them back into the soil if you are, so for me, I'm growing at the moment a whole lot of broad beans in really big pots that I hope to put tomatoes in straight after. How can I keep that in the pot, those nitrogen nodules, if I need to remove most of the roots and stuff?
You'll probably find that the nitrogen will be already in the soil, but digging the nodules back in if you can, or adding them to your compost would be my thoughts there.
So,
I have a question. Question. Is there time? Tell me more about the pH. Like, how often do you use a pH meter, or do you just know by the look of the plant, like a look of a plant, that it's deficient, and so you know that the pH might be wrong? Or how do you actually use the link between the appearance, which is associated with deficiencies in the leaves, and the pH?
Yeah, so in my garden, if I've got a plant that's displaying deficiency symptoms, I'd probably be thinking pH might be what's going wrong, because I do add a lot of compost and other things to my gardens. So they shouldn't be too deficient. The soil shouldn't be that deficient in the nutrients, which is where we can start thinking, well, is it actually nutrient deficiency, or is it just that the plants can't access those nutrients, which is where the pH comes in? So that would be something for me to check before I went and put more fertilizer on my garden.
Okay, so can I ask a question? What do you reckon's wrong with that passion fruit at the garden, that yellow?
I don't know. I think it probably is a pH thing, because we have done tests a couple of times on that bed, and it has been a very alkaline bed. But so far our attempts to bring
have not worked.
And you compare it to my passion fruit out the back, which is 1 metre deep and like 8 metres long. And it would have been planted at a similar time too.
Yeah.
So perhaps getting that passion fruit into line could be a project for us. I mean, I know it already is, but
We've tried.
Yeah.
Passion fruits only last how many years? 3 years or 4 or what?
5.
Yeah, not long.
5 generally.
But we also have blueberries in that bed, don't we? And they also need a
They need
lower
low pH.
pH.
So it'll be interesting to see if we get any fruit off those this year.
Yeah. Well, we got fruit off the blueberries last year.
Okay.
Not that many, about 4 or 5 per plant, but still.
Yes. Not a feast.
Yeah.
So it's nearly 8 o'clock, so you guys are welcome to stick around, but I also understand that people might be wanting to get off to do other things. Just want to say thanks for joining in. We're looking to run a series of these online workshops over the next couple of months.